Mhm. So, do you remember when Halle Berry had to make out grossly with Fred Durst for that terrible music video? She died for our sins. She's the martyr we don't deserve. Gothika is a 2003 horror film brought to you by Dark Castle Entertainment. It stars Halle Berry, Penelope Cruz, Robert Downey Jr., Charles S. Dutton, and John Carroll Lynch. Interesting little tidbit. Robert Downey Jr. is married to Susan Downey. Susan Downey is a co-founder of Dark Castle, even served as its president for quite a long time. And I guess this is them working together. Robert Downey Jr. does excellently in this film, and little did I know that his wife is way cooler than he'll ever be. She's, I guess, responsible for a lot of horror films that mean an awful lot to me. So thank you, Susan Downey. I'm glad you throw your husband a bone every once in a while and get him working Gothica. Gothika is quite a good film. I think Halle Berry gives an exceptional performance here. Very sensitive, very raw, actually. It's a visceral performance. Halle Berry is great in this film. Penelope Cruz, yeah, you got me dead to rights film. My brand new kink is now psychotic Penelope Cruz. I thought she was great. She was excellent. She seemed to have equal amounts of fun and probably a morbid amount of dread portraying her character, who is, as I said, quite psychotic, but also quite beautiful. Uh, it's a sort of contrast that 2000s horror made it their goal to project. I love Dark Castle films. I have loved this project where I've been going through the Dark Castle catalog of the 2000s and really just investigating them because they're a lot more complicated than people think they are. What is Gothica trying to tell us? I'm the mirror. Gothica gives us the horror genre as a distorted view of itself. The audience is the mirror. The mirror that reflects the distortion, but also makes sense of the visuals, also can make it seem visually articulate, metaphorically sound. Horror is a distorted view of the world and of its own genre in the 2000s, and the audience are the mirror. And psychopathy is contagious in Dark Castle films. Gothika states that the ability to repress is a survival tool. Without it, we would not have survived. Horror it has a difficult job in the world of cinema. Horror is where you combat and confront trauma and terrible, shared miseries. It's where you confront on a massive scale and even sometimes on a hyper micro personal one, you confront trauma, either as a culture or as an individual, or as both sometimes. Horror is where you confront difficult things. It's where difficult topics are suggested. They're not necessarily hyper focused on in a hyper literal way. They're distorted. So when you're watching a horror film, you're watching a distorted reflection of some kind of symptom of culture that is leading to a morbid actual lived-in reality. When you're watching a horror film, especially one that was of the 2000s, especially something like Gothika, and I think this is just true of horror throughout the ages and all of the eras. Horror is a distorted view of reality, and horror is where you confront the most difficult and darkest aspects of reality. But in order for you to truly combat and confront the darkest places of the human condition, you have to do it through horror and you have to do it through distortion. Gothica is an exercise, an experiment in gaslighting. The horror genre is successful. The horror genre succeeds within its framework by gaslighting the audience. This film is about being gaslit by the horror genre. Horror is built upon shared delusions. It's built upon shared fears, but fears through a distorted image become delusional. Horror is built upon shared delusions. Shared delusions writ large. We are all psychotic, cinematically speaking, at least. We confront the darkest parts of our lives through distorted means, often through horror films that are primarily metaphorical and not necessarily overt with its meanings, but it hits you internally. You don't even realize that it's happening, but you're confronting some really, really dark and twisted shit when you're watching films like Gothika. I think that the best line of the film is almost like a badass Bruce Willis, Arnold Schwarzenegger moment that Halle Berry gets to have at the end of the film when she after she watches the John Carroll Lynch character just get engulfed in flames, she says, well, I mean, let me set it up properly. He says, "This is illogical." And then Halle Berry's character, Miranda, says, "Logic is overrated." No truer words have ever been spoke in a horror film. House on Haunted Hill is one of my favorite horror films of all time. It's also the first Dark Castle film. House on Haunted Hill is an experimentation, or actually more like an expose of the artificiality of the horror genre. It's a lampooning of the logical trappings within horror sequences. It's a complete takedown of horror adrenaline fueled tropes and setups and set pieces and stories and metaphors and archetypes. House on Haunted Hill is a completely beautiful and brilliant and masterful film because, like I said, it is an expose of the artificiality of horror, all while it's also like a testament towards horror's effectiveness that you can't logically undo something that is scary within cinema. Logic does not matter. Logic is overrated. So by the time Gothika came out, Dark Castle had already done, 13 Ghosts and Ghost Ship. We've already returned. Dark Castle has conquered the fucking world, and this is their victory lap. Gothika is. Logic is overrated. Logic try to speak logically to a delusional person, and you'll see how futile, how fruitless logic actually is. And if we take what I said earlier, that horror is about shared delusions, cinema even is largely about shared delusions. If you try to speak logically to a moviegoer, to a public, to an audience, to a culture, then you are not speaking their language. They don't understand what you're saying. You must speak illogically through horror. You must speak in a distorted tone with distorted dialect to really communicate with the audience. And Gothica is a beautiful representation of that fascinating sort of cinematic and thematic concept. I'm really impressed by Gothica. Gothica is really well put together. It builds upon the kind of new metal meets trip hop aesthetic that Dark Castle built its name upon. It is really, really interesting and really good. Robert Downey Jr. is very entertaining here. He reminded me of what it was like to have him pre Tony Stark, pre MCU, where he was like a kind of very interesting sort of screen presence. He was a treat. He was special. And now I don't exactly feel the same way, but this reminded me of being fascinated by Robert Downey Jr. in my teens and being really thrilled by his performances and his choices that he made as an actor. A really interesting actor. I don't think we get to see that interesting part of him, those interesting components that made him who he was to me when I was younger. we see just now like a tried and true format that is, the product of Robert Downey Jr. But before it wasn't quite like that. Halle Berry proves that she is like one of the best actors of her generation. She's gorgeous, but a lot more than that, she is sophisticated. She is complicated. And I think even a lot more than that, she isn't sophisticated or complicated when she needs to be completely raw, visceral, and impactful. Sophistication is overrated, logic is overrated. Halle Berry goes for the jugular in this film with her performances. When a scene calls for some sort of pseudo sophistication, normally when you're acting against Robert Downey Jr., it would call for some sort of intellectual posturing. She meets him on that level every single time. But when it calls for just some sort of morbid shock and awe, Halle Berry is there and more than capable of transcending some of the loonier aspects of the Gothika film. Uh, Everything about this film is a plus, is a benefit to its philosophical properties. I think that Gothica is a very, very good film. As I said, I see it as the Dark Castle victory lap. They came, they saw, they conquered, right? Gothica is excellent, and I'm a big fan of it, a huge fan of Dark Castle. I was thrilled by this film. Very thrilled. Logic is overrated. That is the motto of Dark Castle. And in a large way, it's, like I said, one of the most truthful things ever uttered in a horror film. I've been your cult boyfriend talking to you about Gothica 2003. I hope you enjoyed my video. I hope you found some sort of value in it. I hope it was useful to you in some sort of way. Definitely like the video. If you want to comment and start some discourse about Gothica, I'm here, I'm available, and I'd love to discuss this film. Thank you for watching me. Um, and that's all. That is really all. Have a good one, everyone.